You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Okay, today is December 1st, 2022. I'm Peter Betke. I am director of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics here at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And we are here today to discuss the relatively recent new book by Mark Koyama and Jared Rubin, How the World Became Rich, The Historical Origins of Economic Growth. And we have a stellar panel to discuss that. And the way the program is going to go is that Mark and Jared have around 20 minutes to give us an overview of the book. And then we will have our panel talking 10 to 15 minutes each, discussion of their comments on the book. And then we will have a roundtable discussion afterwards. And so we are very fortunate today to have Lisa Blaydes, who's a professor of political science at Stanford University. She'll be the first commenter. And then after her, Nathan Nunn, who's a professor at UBC up in Canada. And then after him, Joel Mokyr, who's a professor at Northwestern University. So anyway, thank you very much all for coming. And Jared and Mark, you guys have the floor.
Great. So I'm very happy to be here, and I'm honored to be, sharing a platform with such distinguished commentators, Joel, Nathan, and Lisa. I'm looking forward to their comments. So let me just briefly talk about some of the motivation that Jared and I had when writing How the World Became Rich, and give a brief overview of some of the things I think we set out to achieve in the book. So we wanted to write a single stop economic history of economic growth. So we're writing an economic history of the world. We begin, in early ancient times in the classical period, but we're not writing a chronological history. We're not going into a lot of details about every part of the world. We're really focusing on the story of economic growth, and we're doing so initially thematically. So we're considering some of the major kind of factors which scholars have suggested as being important in determining rates of growth. So things like geography, things like institutions, things like colonialism, culture. And then once we've done that, once we've kind of set out these important themes, we go into a bit more of a narrative about why a particular episode of economic growth, which began in Northwest Europe, really in the period after 1500, event came to fruition with the British Industrial Revolution beginning in the 18th century, and then how, once industrialization got started, this process spread to other parts of the world. And so it's a concise book, it's short, but we think it hits those important major themes. Now, I'll just draw attention to one or two things which I think might be relevant for our conversation today. And so one is that we very much set out why growth matters. So we kind of are quite strong on this point that economic growth has been incredibly beneficial for humanity, both in allowing far more people to live on the planet than would otherwise be possible, and allowing the vast majority of them to enjoy far higher living standards than were possible in the past. So growth is good, and growth enables us to consume more, to live longer lives, to live healthier lives, to live lives with more meaning. And there's no necessary trade-off between economic growth and other factors we might care about. So in some sense, from a long-run perspective at least, things like climate change are going to be, even though there's a short-run trade-off between economic production that causes pollution that contributes to man-made climate change, in the long run, we think that innovation and growth are going to bring technologies and other abilities to ameliorate or potentially deal with such grave challenges. And so growth is vital, and understanding growth requires a historical perspective, and that's what we're offering here. So there are many great books in development economics or on the topic of economic growth, but most of them focus on the modern period, or if they do take a historical view, they often focus on one aspect. So, Why Nations Fail by S.M. Robinson focuses on institutions, and we wanted to be a little bit more broad-minded and widen the scope to consider all the factors which have contributed to the growth process, without necessarily, at least initially, taking a strong stance on one particular driver of economic growth. So another thing we should draw attention to is that we're very much aware that there were episodes of growth historically in the past. So the British Industrial Revolution is not the only episode of economic growth to have happened before the modern era. There were other periods of prosperity. For example, in the ancient world, during the Commercial Revolution in Europe, in the Middle East during the Golden Age of Islam, in Song Dynasty China, and other periods as well. But those periods of growth came to an end. They were not self-sustaining. So our interest, particularly as we go on in the book, is what factors made economic growth in Western Europe after 1500 self-sustaining. And there, when you think about the different factors we've outlined, so we think about geography, we think about institutions, we think about culture, and we try and bring those factors together to try and tell a coherent story about why this particular growth episode didn't peter out. So in particular, we focus on innovation. So many scholars, including, of course, Joel, have emphasized the importance of innovation. Innovation is the real factor driving economic growth. Had rates of innovation kind of slowed down after 1750 or after 1800, you might have had a one-off improvement in living standards, but not a breakthrough to sustain economic growth. So innovation is the driver of long-run growth. And so we're interested in this question: why was Western Europe particularly innovative after 1500? And their cultural factors are very important, and they complement institutional factors. So this is about how the world becomes less negative sum and becomes more positive sum. And there we think institutions, culture, these things are working together in particular ways, which generate this unique outcome in the case of Europe after 1500 and after 1750. And then we then move on to this discussion of the spread of growth. So how did growth diffuse across the rest of the world? Here, several factors are pretty important. One is colonial rule. So the fact of European empire after 1500, we don't think of ourselves, at least, and again, we don't take a super strong stance on this, but we don't think it's one of the most important drivers of the initial breakthrough, but we do think it matters a lot for the diffusion of growth thereafter. So some parts of the world were able to industrialize much quicker following the Industrial Revolution. Those are parts of the world like North America, which had kind of institutions inherited by the British, which were kind of suitable for growth, and made other preconditions, geographical preconditions, high levels of human capital, which made the Industrial Revolution possible early on in North America. Similarly, you have a diffusion of growth to Western Europe, and then it's harder for growth to spread for other parts of the world. So the period after 1800 is this great enrichment, as Deirdre McCloskey calls it, but it also sees a great divergence because other parts of the world don't see this acceleration in growth that we see in Western Europe and its kind of offshoots. And so then the final part of the book, we talk about why this is, and then why in the 20th century you've seen convergence. So you see initially divergence with the Industrial Revolution, and then convergence more recently. And the convergence has been driven in a large part by economic growth in East Asia, particularly after World War II, then more recently in other parts of the world, such as Sub-Saharan Africa. And that convergence follows, we think, again, following the work of other scholars, particularly Alexander Gershikov, the convergence story is different to the initial growth story. So the institutions which enabled, say, Japan or later South Korea and Taiwan and Singapore to experience such rapid growth in the 20th century didn't have to be the same as the types of preconditions you needed in England in 1800. And ditto again for China, which is, of course, was the fastest growing economy in the late 20th century and early 21st century. Then very different institutions, very different configurations of power were necessary because China was so far from the frontier, it was experiencing catch-up growth. And that catch-up growth didn't require the same support for, say, property rights or maybe intellectual property rights, although that's debatable, as we think were required in the earlier growth episodes. And so to summarize and to conclude, we think the book is offering kind of a unique, concise, historical take on the process of economic growth. So one which is relevant both for people interested in economic history, both historians who maybe don't know that much about the economic side of things, as well as economists who maybe don't know as much about the historical side of things. So hopefully it can inform debates in development economics and as well as debates in economic history. And I look forward to the comments from Lisa, Nathan, and Joel.
Well, thank you all for being here. Lisa, Joel, Nathan, Pete. Yeah, this is really an amazing honor to have you all here to talk about this book, which was something that Mark and I came up with a while ago. That, or at least we thought that there was this kind of hole in the not the literature so much, but there was nothing that synthesized the literature in this for this big question, one of the biggest questions in economics. It's really one of the questions that made me want to become an economist, is trying to understand why certain parts of the world became rich and others have lagged behind and continue to lag behind, while others have caught up, etc. This is a literature that has grown immensely in the last couple of decades and really hasn't been synthesized in any way that's kind of digestible, for sure. And it's also, I think it's a type of literature that a lot of people are interested in, beyond academia, but also undergrads. It's the type of question that I think if we can get across to especially undergraduates, people that might be looking to see what they're going to do with their lives, might be interested in economics in general, if we can get across to them that these are questions that economists answer, and they answer with history, and then they can apply these insights into really doing just about anything, whether it be development, or, thinking through the processes of economic growth, things like this, then this can be a powerful tool. And this is when Mark and I kind of realized when we were talking about this, that there's nothing out there that does this. So this is why we wrote this book. And really, we wrote it, we tried to write it in such a way that it would be accessible. And I hope we succeeded in this, accessible to people well beyond the academy, people that do not have the background to really, know one article from another, or frankly, even read a lot of the articles that we summarize. So what is this book about? Last month I was at Stanford, and Lisa asked me that exact question, asked me to summarize it in just a few sentences. With most academic books, you should be able to do that. With my previous book, with Mark's book, with books written by the people in this room, you really should be able to do that. Most people can. And because most books have a strong thesis that they're trying to promote, this book does not. The first half of this book is meant to summarize the literature. It's meant to organize it and, for the most part, be dispassionate. Now, we're not completely dispassionate, and I'll talk about that in a second, on one or two factors in the literature. And then the second half is meant to then apply these insights from the literature into why certain parts of the world become rich. We start with Britain, which you have to, I think, in a book like this, because they're obviously the first place where the modern economy emerged. We then discuss other places that soon followed suit, North America and Western Europe, and then East Asia. Parts of East Asia became rich, beginning with Japan, and then in the 20th century of East Asian tigers, and then eventually, really, if you want to talk about how the world became rich, China and India are the two places you have to really at least discuss to some extent. So China is obviously well on the path to becoming at least what we call rich, and maybe I should even before going into the book just say what we mean by that. We don't mean rich in the way that having mansions and lots of consumer goods and things like this. We essentially mean sufficiently far enough away from poverty levels where that's not something that one thinks about in their day to day. The very basics of life. And this is something that, as many will know, but certainly here, and hopefully many of our listeners know that this is something that for the lot of most humans in world history, that was their life. It's relatively close enough to poverty where the basics were not always assured. And the real achievement, I think, of the last certainly 200 years, but you could even say half century, has been to remove large fractions of the world away from that. And that's what we mean by rich. Of course, there's still at least 1 billion people that are very much in poverty. And that's something we're not blind to this. We understand that the whole world is not actually rich. That said, more of the world is moving away from those levels of poverty than ever before. And this is something that deserves to both be celebrated and also understood. So what this book does is the first half, again, it breaks this literature down, this large and growing literature. So if we, Mark and I talked about, hopefully if this book ends up doing pretty well, and I think early signs are somewhat positive in that direction, we'd love to be able to write a second edition at some point. And the second edition will look a little different than the first edition, both because I think we've learned and had our thoughts have evolved, I think, a bit since writing the book, but also this is a literature that is continuously evolving as well. And some of the stuff that we've written in this book actually may change because of the literature changing, but also certainly in the latter chapters when we talk about more modern growth, stuff is changing as well. So the first half looks at 5 what we call strands of the literature, 5 different chapters that look at various aspects of the literature and try to understand both their impact on how the world became rich and also how they interact with each other. And so my thinking has evolved a bit on this. We've done a lot of these types of events since the book has come out, and just through talking through it and talking through it with Mark and with interviewers and it's like this, I think I've come to a few realizations as well. So maybe I'll quickly go through those. So the first one's geography. These are kind of one of the oldest set of explanations that geographical endowments, whether it be coastline, climate, rainfall, things like this, that they can contribute to certain parts of the world being wealthy or not. Coal being a big one in terms of the industrialization. We kind of take the broad literature as saying geographical endowments certainly do not determine the fate of nations in terms of their economic outcomes, but they can obviously set some of the relevant constraints. And really what they do is it sets how the other types of things we know are important vary across societies, especially things like institutions. Societies that an island like Britain is just going to have a different set of institutions than, say, a country in the steppe like Mongolia or something like this. And some of this is just purely geography based. All right. The next one, and I'm going out of order by chapter, but I think I have a reason for doing this, is colonization. And this is one where we tried to be dispassionate, I think, in the first 6 chapters in terms of trying our best to say, well, this is what the authors of these books or articles would have wanted to say. But we do think that the arguments in favor of colonization as being important for Britain's industrialization overall are pretty weak in this literature. On the other hand, the arguments in favor of colonization playing a significant role in the colonized failing to catch up in some places or being much slower to catch up, and Nathan has done some very good work on this, I think are much stronger. So when we think about the big question on why the world or how the world became rich, when we're thinking about, beyond just Britain and beyond just, parts of Western Europe, especially those nations that were the colonizers, not the colonizees or the colonized, um, colonization, I think there's fairly convincing evidence that it has played a key role. And again, oftentimes this is through these other things that we talk about. So institutions, there's now a large literature connecting the colonial past of institutions. I think culture as well. And again, this is also something Nathan's worked on, certainly in the context of sub-Saharan Africa, that, the cultural traits and ones that we think of as being pretty important for economic development vary across the formerly colonized world. And some of these can be traced back directly to certain aspects of the colonial past, these areas. All right, the third one is culture. And we want to be very careful here in the sense of, we don't mean culture in the way that people that social scientists of the early 20th century meant it, where essentially trying to have some highly Eurocentric explanation for why Europe's great and the rest of the world is poor. We mean culture by the way that people view the world, the way the heuristics they use to simplify the world, and this clearly differs across societies. We know that, say, levels of trust differ across societies, which we also think of as being important for economic development. I'd say, like geography, culture does not determine the fate of nations. This is not something I think that at least I would accept seriously as being a purely cultural explanation for why the world, certain parts of the world become rich and others have not. It's not the only thing, but it does provide constraints, much like geography. We can think of it as providing the context under which certain types of institutions work. And I think even more so than geography, and certainly geography doesn't even qualify here, but culture is in many ways intimately intertwined with institutions, to the point where somebody like Abbe would even not necessarily distinguish between certain aspects of culture and institutions. They're one and the same. So in this context, I think we can say, culture really imposes stronger constraints on how institutions work and why they work differently in different societies. And so many of the rules that make institutions work in the way they do are informal, and where these informal institutions or informal rules come from is the society's cultural past. And all that this means is not, if we don't consider this, we're not going to really understand how institutions work and why they work differently in different societies. All right, then the fourth one is institutions. Maybe not surprisingly, if you do know any of my work, that I do view this as being among the most important of the five pillars that we lay out here, in terms of as helping us understand why different societies have had different outcomes over time, and particularly why even it's sometimes the dog that didn't bark, I think. And what I mean by this is, when we think of, England, or Britain in the early 18th, 19th centuries had relatively limited institutions, even though, Parliament was, partially corrupt. It certainly wasn't like every person could vote, things like this. There was constraint on executive power. Now, did that mean that England was going to become inventive? No. I mean, we have plenty of other other examples of places that had relatively limited governance, but did not industrialize. The Dutch Republic, I think, being a contemporaneous case that suggests that. That said, having those institutions meant that you didn't have things like you had in, say, Imperial China at the time, or a place that I've studied, the Ottoman Empire at the time, where those types of political institutions were quite constraining. So again, it's not the things like political institutions that constrain executive power are a sufficient case for parts of the world becoming rich, and in fact, they're not even necessary. I think that we now see places like China certainly becoming rich by the way we have determined it, or described it rather, in the last 40 years, with very unlimited executive power. That said, there is a pretty strong correlation here, and I think that when we're trying to say, what makes a society rich, or what gets it at least away from the worst of poverty, these types of institutions have been shown to be quite important in many different contexts. The fifth one and final one is demography, and I think this is the one where my opinions change the most. In that, on the one hand, demography is kind of clearly important in terms of what we the literature calls the demographic, having a demographic transition to fewer kids, typically, where as economists use these kind of terrible words when talking about people focusing on quality instead of quantity, having fewer but maybe more better educated children. This is something that even in the context of England in the 19th century, kind of clearly led to greater income per capita, having some type of transition like this. I think where what we often see here, though, is that with a couple of exceptions, France being one, these transitions typically happen after a lot of the things that we care about in terms of say institutional change, maybe even cultural change, the type of stuff Joel's worked on, and the culture of growth that are quite important for the kind of as the prime movers. So where does this leave us? We have these different strands. We, on the one hand, we say, all right, well, context matters. And I think, going back to Lisa's question, I think that, and I know that a couple of readers have been frustrated with the book, because you kind of throw up your hands and say, well, if context matters, what are you really telling us about how the world became rich? On the other hand, I'd say what the book, I'd like to think, does is say that this doesn't necessarily mean that just anything goes. What it means is we have 5 things we can look at, and then we can say, well, all right, well, what are the contexts in which they work? We know in which we know it has worked in the past. And we can say, all right, well, Britain had a certain set of factors. Britain had a set of factors that, as I just noted, it had relatively limited executive power. It had a number of other things, a lot of what, Joel's talked about, particularly in, say in the Enlightened economy, it had a set of skilled workers, had large internal markets. It had a culture that was more of a pan-European culture of, shared scientific endeavor that also were growth was a thing that could happen and was something that, and this is kind of, I think, we discussed this in the book. One of the more, I think it's one of the more convincing culture, the most convincing cultural argument, specifically on why Britain became rich. But then we say, all right, well, why Britain became rich is really one of the big questions in economic history. I think this literature has something to say to it, not just specifically the literature on the Industrial Revolution that, just discussing, but, more broadly going back, prior to the mid 18th and 19th century. But then we can also say, well, the catch-up growth that happens after this is just going to be a little different. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. But that said, these 5 factors are going to be important into understanding why certain parts of the world were able to, even if it's easier because you don't need to reinvent the wheel, why hasn't everyone been able to? Why hasn't the entirety of the world? Why didn't it become rich? And why has it taken some places over a century longer than others? And that's where I think the book, again, may be frustrating to some, in that we don't have, there isn't an answer. And I think in many respects that is the answer of the book. There is no answer. On the other hand, we can look at these factors and take these factors and understand for each case why certain parts did end up becoming successful, why some parts eventually caught up. And frankly, then I think, we don't spend as much time on this, in part because, I think we're not development economists. We are economic historians. That's our specialty. We do try to bring in the 20th and 21st century in the final chapter, but I think much more can be done on this, is to say, well, what are the lessons that can be used to understand why certain parts of the world remain impoverished, and what should we expect to see in the next, generation or two? I mean, I'm actually quite optimistic that, that many parts of the world are going to become wealthier, and again, wealth as we describe it here, not $70,000 a year per capita GDP wealthy, but $10,000 a year per capita GDP, which is really what in a sense what we care about. It's that, getting up to $5,000 to $10,000 a year of per capita GDP makes such a big difference relative to $3 to $4 a day, around $1,000 to $1,500. Relative that difference is much more important than, say, the jump from 15,000 to 30,000 or from 30,000 to 60,000. That's what the book tries to describe, and it's really, again, the literature that we try to bring together here to try to give some insight into what has been said and where we can go with this.
Thanks very much for inviting me to talk about this book. It's a very easy book to praise, so I'm going to limit myself to just a couple of points before going on to some questions that I had about the research program and just some things that came to mind while reading How the World Became Rich. So I want to start by saying that a major strength of the book is in its organization. While a lot of us write thinking about ourselves, what we want to say, how we want to say it, you guys have really thought about the end user. And I think that you've really tried to put forward a book that is easy for readers to comprehend a really vast and complicated literature, and also for instructors to think about how they want to try to engage with this material. And so I really like the kind of very well-built internal scaffolding of the book, where you have a kind of descriptive opening that tells us what is the puzzle, is the world actually rich, a kind of end that talks about what does the modern economy look like. And then sandwiched in between are these two really wonderfully synthetic chapters and sets of chapters that talk about the different thematic explanations for economic development and a basic path to a kind of modern global economy, as well as this kind of nested design where you've got this story about Europe. Why is Europe different? Why is Northwestern Europe different? And then why is England different? And I think that both instructors and readers will really appreciate this and the ability to assign different portions of the project to readers based on what the syllabus of the course might look like. So for me, the two most exciting portions are really the ones that, again, sort of seek to give an idea about what those explanations are, and then create that kind of nested model of what was going on with kind of England at the core. And I think that, you say that there's not really an argument. And here I think you guys are excessively modest. And what I would say is that for me, reading the argument, or the argument really is the curation of this literature into these 5 categories, right? That is the argument. And the argument is related to what is omitted, right? So essentially, the way I see it, geography is the first order factor from which these other explanatory factors flow. And then you ultimately see development as a contingent outcome, where these 4 additional factors that are related to geography interact with each other to create this outcome that we call economic development. That said, my sense is that that is the argument of the book, but because the book is, I would consider, a little overly focused on the literature and economic history, it provides only a partial picture. And so I think part of the reason for this is what is published or publishable within the field of economics. And so I'm going to make some suggestions in terms of my more critical engagement with the book, in terms of the omissions and what you've left out. And I think that, it's important to think about what's missing, because the things that are missing actually do relate to these 5 main categories of explanation that you provide. So the first, I think, is related to the importance of the state and state capacity. So why is more of a focus on the state absolutely essential? I think in part because the state interacts with and is intimately connected to geography, institutions, culture, demography, and colonialism. The history of state development is, of course, the history of economic development is, of course, related to the history of the state and societies around the world. You need a state to establish social order. Without social order, you can't really even begin to think about this question about how do you create constraints on an executive. So a first order condition is to sort of think about the conditions under which you create social order. And of course, these ideas are really old. We can think about, Huntington's work on this. North, Wallace, and Weingast talk a lot about the importance and the creation of social orders. It's a major focus in the narrow corridor. Mark Dincheko has written a lot about this in terms of the ordering of what has to come. First, you have to have a state, then the interaction of the state with executive constraint is important for the development of economy. My personal small quibble with Dincheko is you need an intellectual or informal institutional foundation for executive constraint before states become too strong. Otherwise, I think that it's really difficult to ultimately get that possibility for executive constraint. So you also don't engage a lot with the question of the relationship between elites and rulers within states. To the extent you do, it's mostly in the context of the literature on the emergence of parliaments. But I think this is actually a much bigger question and one that needs to be unpacked to a greater extent. Um, you talk about the importance of technology and human capital, but where do skilled workers come from? Typically, they are products of state efforts to create literate societies. Where does mutual intelligibility come from? Typically, state efforts to create a common language over its territory through schools, conscription, and often violence allows for that mutual intelligibility. Jim Scott teaches us that states seek to order societies and render them legible with huge implications for development. So without the state, it's really hard to think about, for me to think about economic development. The second factor that I think deserves more emphasis is related to what I would call cross cultural global encounters. So, for me, this is not just about trade, but it's everything from the migration of people and diaspora communities, workers, and the movement of ideas and cultural tropes and technology across space. And so I would encourage you to think more about these interconnections between world regions and the implications of those interconnections for growth. So we know that these types of encounters were important drivers of the pre-modern global economy, thus setting the stage for later forms of economic takeoff. How should we think about proto-globalization? And why only talk about these cross-cultural global encounters or primarily talk about them in terms of colonization? So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. One, I would think more about the economic integration of Europe into the Mediterranean economy in the 12th century and how important that was to as a driver of the commercial revolution. So, some of what I've written suggests that European engagements with Muslim societies in the form of Holy Land crusades were actually really important for Europeans to establish trade, economic, and even transportation connections to the Mediterranean world at a time when it wasn't clear how European state development or city development was going to really go. So, to what extent has European engagement with Muslim societies actually served as a deep and foundational driver of economic and political development? This is just sort of one example from within the West. There's also minimal engagement with the importance of cross regional trade within Asia. In other words, should we think more about what was going on, not in the context of Europe engaging with other parts of the world, but other parts of the world engaging with each other? So we know that Eurasian trade was absolutely essential for economic development within Asia for a millennium. But again, the book is very European focused. And so are there ways to think about exchange between the Middle East and China, South Asia and Southeast Asia? And how do these economic relationships influence growth, technology exchange, creation of diaspora communities that were important for growth? So again, I wouldn't want you to think about my discussion about the importance of the state or these cross cultural encounters as a critique of the book. These aren't flaws, but rather to me, they're just omissions. And I would think that these are things that maybe would lead you to write an additional 2 books in the future that would tackle this question about what is the role of state in economic development and how should we think about cross-cultural global encounters beyond trade. I just want to thank you guys for giving me the chance to talk about this book. It's a very important project, and I was really glad to have a chance to engage with it.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks for the invitation to talk today, which is, I think, a great honor to be here with fellow panelists and in the company of Jared and Mark. So I'll just echo Lisa and say that the book is fantastic. I think for sure adopt it in my PhD course. And it provides the nice, in the words of Lisa, scaffolding that really helps to synthesize the literature. I think this doesn't exist. The literature is really only from, the vast majority of it, or a lot of it, particularly the empirical literature, is from the last 20 years. So it really makes sense that we haven't had a book like this that really synthesizes and really digs deeply into the content. So I've seen the book at different stages. I think I saw an outline and then saw what was I thought close to a final manuscript, but not near as rich and as detailed as this. And at each point, it's kind of like, I'm trying to think of a good analogy, a work of art, where at first you see the sketch, and you're like, oh, that's cool, good idea. I think it'd be great to do that. And then you see it developed more, and you're like, wow, there's a lot of texture and detail. Then you have the final work of art, which is just extremely rich and complex and insightful. And I think that really surprised me to some extent, not just exactly how the extent to which it was really insightful in those dimensions. And so I just encourage anyone who has an interest in this area to definitely read it, even if you think you know the literature. And so for me, that's why I thought, oh, okay, I know all of this. Definitely the richness in the economic history of Britain, of Europe, I didn't know that. But even the more macro empirical literature that I did know, there is a huge number of insights. So let me talk about, I have just a few bigger picture comments, and I wouldn't call them criticisms, but just food for thought. The thing that's closest to a criticism, and I think I gave you this feedback already, is actually the title. So how the world became rich, and Jared's talked a lot about that. Maybe more accurate, how a subset of the world became rich, another subset stagnated, and another subset grew, but grew only slowly, right? So you can tell I've never read a book that anyone reads, because I would be terrible at creating titles. But that would be more accurate to some extent. But maybe more catchy would be how the world became unequal, right? And I think you would acknowledge this. We know I think it's the first figure where you see the divergence of incomes per capita of regions or societies around the world. We see there's been divergence big time, which is the title of this great JEP piece by Lant Pritchett. And we know that's just another way of saying it, right? And so what you're thinking of is, well, the world's become rich on average. That's for sure true, because some areas have stagnated, some areas have taken off. And then the question is, well, why of those areas that have stagnated, you just said this in your comments, why haven't they taken off? And that's kind of the frame of everything, right? And there's some quotes here on page 220. The advent of modern economic growth created tremendous opportunities for catch-up growth, but these were difficult to grasp, right? Talking about the Atlantic trade, there's that it benefited Europe, but it didn't benefit everyone equally, right? And then chapter 11, the very final chapter, is the world is rich. And the second sentence, the world is becoming richer, which means that more of humanity can be lifted from dire poverty, right? So it's very optimistic, which, knowing Jared and Mark, who are positive, nice guys, that's not surprising. But so I just want to raise the question, and this is related a little bit to one of Lisa's comments: is part of economic success zero sum? Right. So is the wealth of the rich somehow related to the suffering of the poor? That's maybe putting it too strongly, but I think it's interesting to think about. If you think about that, you say, well, that's not quite consistent with the data, because what we'd expect is certain groups take off and other groups then do worse. Instead, we see nobody seems to be doing worse over time, but some groups are taking off, right? And so that's saying, well, certain groups are doing things which are good, others aren't adopting that. If we stop to think at a more concrete level, and you do this in the book, in the chapter on colonialism for sure, is just, in logical terms, some activities are zero sum, right? Colonialism, right? You're extracting resources, and then you're kind of in some sense bargaining over the surplus. Is at least a zero sum aspect to that. The slave trade, that's zero sum. People who are being enslaved are definitely losing. Others are gaining. Some middlemen are gaining and losing. depending on how you look at it, plantation slavery. So on logical terms, there is some zero-sumness in the world. There is some positive sumness. So then returning, how much of it is zero-sum? So it's zero. To say zero is probably not quite right, nothing. But realistically, is it something that we can ignore? Coming back to what we should expect is some societies just doing worse, not stagnating, right? And so in a world where you have subsistence income, right, you really can't have stagnation. You can have, because what's going to happen is once income per capita gets too low, populations will die, and then you'll go back to subsistence income. So it's really not possible in the data that we're looking at with per capita income for groups to decline, right? But you could say, well, what would be a group declining? Well, it would be huge population losses. So then we can say, well, let's think about the history of the world, the Columbian Exchange. Do we observe huge population losses? And the answer is definitely the case, right? Indigenous populations, we really don't know, but the best guess is 80 to 95% of indigenous populations were eliminated within the first 100, 150 years after 1492. So some of that is conflict. A big part of that is disease, but also lots of it's policy and strategic policies. So a great example of that is a recent paper by Don Fair, Rob Gillizo, and Maggie Jones, where they look at the decimation of the bison in North America. Part of this was an intentional policy by the government to decimate the bison, to kill the bison, because there are these actually quite affluent nations which live off the bison, right? And so if you can depopulate them, then you can have Europeans move to the frontier, right? And so that's actually just an example of growth, but there's at least a zero-sum component, and there are groups which are being hurt, right? But it's a question of, is this more general? And this relates to Lisa's comment about cross-cultural global encounters and the interconnections between regions and the interconnections between the success and less success or even declines of different regions. Definitely a relevant paper here is Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, The Rise of Europe, in the American Economic Review 2005. And so you mentioned that, well, there's not a lot of evidence, which I would agree with, about sugar, cotton specifically being super, super important for the Industrial Revolution. There's also not a lot of evidence in terms of regressions, analysis showing that it's not, right? And so I think the best evidence we have is this macro type of studies. Acemoglu, Johnson, Robinson's 2005 paper. It's not perfect. I think even better is Luigi Pascali, AER 2017, where he has this very nice instrument for trade. It's looking at 1870 to 1913, but that is during the colonial period for Africa, for example. And 37 countries only. So we would think, if you divide the world, we think there's about 200. No countries from Black Africa. So it overrepresents the rich countries. But what does he find, actually, when you estimate the causal effect using this fancy instrument I won't get into, causal effect of trade on growth? Well, it's actually negative for about 90% of the sample, right? So again, this is evidence of a decline in zero-sumness. Just to be really specific, you have to have a polity score in 1860 above 6 for you to have a positive effect. The highest polity score in the sample is 7, right? The highest possible is 10. So that's some evidence, at least, that perks my questioning about this, is how much of the success of the successful is due to the failure of the poorer societies. If we think of the United States, and you have a nice discussion of this, slavery, that's clearly zero-sum. As I mentioned just now, frontier expansion is clearly zero-sum. And these are probably the two things that really are quintessential and key to the success of the United States, right? So I think that's just food for thought. And in volume 2, it might be something to think about, how much of this, the success of the rich is due to the poverty of the poor. I think related to this, and this is just think about the conceptual framework. Typically in economics, and particularly in the growth literature, long-run development literature, there's a desire to identify the one causal factor that led to economic growth. So when I was a grad student, it was institutions versus other things, and there was a big debate, which made it very fun and exciting. And the book doesn't fall into this trap, right? And you said, even, I think there is no answer is the conclusion. That's probably why it's not particularly intellectually satisfying for some people, because they want the one silver bullet. I think even you have a sentence in there that says there is no silver bullet. But it does fall into that trap a little bit, which is understandable, because we do, when you talk about Britain's industrial revolution. How is Britain different? It wasn't different on this dimension, so it couldn't have been that factor, for example. And I think this is not about the book, because the book's taking a clear step forward, but our profession, right? It's natural for us to view economic growth from the perspective, and this is because of the history of our profession, the physical sciences. So like physics. So a question like, there's a ball, we see the ball move. Why did that ball move? It could have been you dropped it and it's gravity. It could have been hit by something, but there's a single answer, right? But if we view economic growth from the perspective of life sciences, evolutionary biology, and think of growth as a dynamic, organic, evolutionary system, then it really doesn't make sense to say, well, what caused lizards to be lizards, right? Or what is the one thing that's super important for us to breathe, right? Or even like, what is the most important organ of the body, right? We could debate. I think it's the heart. I think it's the lungs. I think it's the skin. It just conceptually doesn't make a lot of sense, right? And I think if we, through introspection, think of ourselves as economists, we fall into that trap. And so the book is a step forward out of thinking that way, which I think is fantastic. And then just two last things. Is part of economic success luck, right? Randomness, just the residual. Any of these regressions in the papers that you analyze where there's one factor, like, let me pick on myself, the slave trade, it explains maybe 3% of the total variation, right? So what's the 97% is a lot of it luck. And there's this great paper, which Mark Koyama is a co-author on, the fractured land hypothesis, where the nice thing about that paper is typically we have a model, and then the model has an equilibrium, and we say these are the comparative statics, or this was important for that equilibrium. No, they realize that history is probabilistic. There's contingencies, there's randomness. And so what they do is they engage in simulations, right? And just to quote them, we focus on pattern predictions rather than replicating specific outcomes. And so they actually report distributions over outcomes because they recognize that history is contingent, right? So it's a little harder when you're thinking about these things descriptively, but it just raises the question of how much of, why was the Industrial Revolution in Britain specifically? Was it just luck? It could have been in, the Netherlands or other places. And I'm sure Joel will have an opinion about that. And is that the answer? And I'm sure that's not satisfying to a lot of people as well, if that ends up being the answer. And then just the last thing, and we can debate about this on the round table or over beers the next time we see each other, the role of industrial policy. I guess I would have a different view. This comes in when you talk about the United States. I think it was super important for the US. Where did the US get tax revenues before the implementation of income tax? That's a big issue. You get it from tariffs. It's tough for developing countries today. How important was it for the Asian tigers? There's recent studies, Nathan Lane, Maddie Mitronen, Rekha Juhas, showing that at least in specific cases, industrial policy can have benefits, whether it's through factor accumulation, that's Maddie Mitronen, through innovation, Rekha Juhas's paper, or just promoting key industries that have linkages, that's Nathan Lane's paper in South Korea. So that's a minor thing. I think that's like, you just touch on that at the end, but just wanted to mention that so we can flag it for the next time we're having beers and want to debate. And then the last thing is where I'd encourage you to go is the question of what does this all imply for developing countries today? And you actually said, well, we're not development economists, but I think there's huge gains for intellectual arbitrage for individuals who are interested in growth and development issues, like you are, to look at the past, right? Either there's lessons, there's evidence, and just to think about what does the past tell us about the future and tell us about policy. And there's a few gems in the book, which I think one sentence is, growth episodes like the Industrial Revolution were not planned by policymakers. So if you can think of what development is trying to do, it's policymakers, NGOs, somebody trying to plan growth or trying to spur growth. And I think it is natural to think about, or important to think about, well, what were the conditions for growth for the rich countries today? And is development policy trying to replicate that, or are we trying to create a completely different path? And is that what we should be doing, right? And so I think if there's anyone in the profession that has the potential to contribute to understanding deeply about economic development, strategies about development, but from an informed historical perspective, it's probably yourself, Jared, and Mark. And so I would encourage you to be ambitious and don't stop when you're just on the verge of something really, really great. And I think influencing a whole other field within economics, right? Which I think this has the potential to do. So so I look forward to that book. And thank you very much.
All right, I think it's my turn, right? So I'm going to take a slightly different tack. I've written a review of this book, which some of you may have seen, and so I've had my say about it, and I'm not going to comment on it anymore, except perhaps for one sort of amusing editorial note, which is I just put down Brad DeLong's rather hefty economic history of the 20th century, and it's also a very ambitious book, although it has, of course, focuses on the more recent period. But there's a big difference between Brad's book and this book, and not just that Brad's book is 3 times as long, but in Brad's approach, his style is basically to keep citing people left, right, and center and claim that everybody's wrong, and so the sentence "he was wrong" or "she was wrong" appears at least 25 or 30 times in the book. And Jared and Mark are exactly the opposite. I mean, I don't think they say, but anybody they're wrong. I mean, I think that sometimes they think it, but they're too polite and too tactful to say so. And I think it's a difference in style, maybe a difference in the stage of the life cycle that they're at, but I don't think a difference in personal style. I just thought it was sort of an amusing contrast. What I want to do now is take a sort of a slightly different view of the main issue as I see it coming out of this book, even though it's not really discussed explicitly in it. But what this book is about is what Deirdre calls the great enrichment, right? It's true, of course, there's an inequality and all that, but basically, the human race in 2022, for better or for worse, is far richer than it was, 100 or 200 or 500 years ago. And what I want to ask is this really more than just kind of a fluky once in a history event? In other words, have we been riding a black swan? History goes back thousands of years, and it's really only in the last 150, 200, 250, depending on who you read, but it's the last sort of few seconds of a long period in which we got rich. And of course the question is, is this an unusual thing, or is this a once in history event? And if it had not happened for some reason, if something had gone wrong, as it maybe wouldn't have happened at all. I mean, after all, North, Weingast, and Wallace in their book talk about the natural state, and Darren and Jim talk about the extractive society. These are very stable equilibria that had to be upset at some point, and we think that these were upset by the Industrial Revolution. But it didn't have to happen. There's nothing ineluctable about it. And so if it hadn't happened, if the Spanish Inquisition had succeeded taking over Britain, as a result of the Armada in 1588, maybe it wouldn't have happened, and we wouldn't be having this conversation. We'd still be, living in our hovels and struggling against poverty. So that's one thing to think about. And the analogy would be, and maybe this is a bit of a stretch, okay, but you look at mammalian life on this planet, okay. So 65 million years ago, we believe the dinosaurs disappeared, and this gave the mammals an opportunity, and eventually, of course, they came to if not to dominate, certainly become one of the dominant sort of types of life in the planet. And life went on for 60 odd million years without intelligent life as we would recognize it emerging, or so we believe. Now, I understand now that a lot of animals uh, are supposed to be more intelligent than we ever believed. But when somebody will tell me that when my dog will write Schubert's C major symphony, I'll start believing this seriously. Um, and so, why didn't the great enrichment happen before the Industrial Revolution? And so, I have sort of four types of factors that I would like to put on, and then sort of basically argue why they were so slowly but certainly relaxed. Okay, the first story that people tell, and I go back and forth on this sort of fundamental Malthusianism, but basically Malthusian factor being a sort of a classic negative feedback mechanism in which every time income goes up, it unleashes forces that will undo it. And so we're stuck in this sort of iron law world that people like Greg Clark and Oded Galor strongly believe in, and others have sort of mixed feelings about. But clearly, it was something that you can identify. The other form of negative feedback is much more in the tradition of Norse Wallace and Weingast, which I call sort of predators and invasion and local rent seekers, which is that every time there's an area which actually does reasonably well, um, there's some predator that either internal or external that essentially kills the geese that lay the golden eggs. Okay, this happens over and over and over again, and one of the reasons I think that this didn't in the end didn't work in the 18th century was just hard to invade Britain. So if it starts on an island, it's harder for predators to come in, but not for lack of trying, as we all know. Um, and then there are, of course, exogenous shocks, epidemics, climate change. We know that in the past, successful societies have disappeared, like the Mycenaean society in Greece or the classic Maya civilizations that basically lacked the kind of resilience they needed to withstand exogenous shocks like climate change or epidemics or something like that. And finally, and of course, I would get to this, is essentially that, and this is sort of an argument I've made over and over again, is that these societies didn't know enough to overcome what I call the sort of the curse of concavity. And the curse of concavity, what I mean by that, which is sort of a fancy term, I guess, is that every one of the factors that would make economies grow before the Industrial Revolution was subject to very strong diminishing returns. So the gains from trade or capital accumulation, things like that, they could raise income, but after a while, the advantages are exhausted, and you sort of reach some kind of a level, some kind of upper bound. Now that's not the case, of course, when knowledge is based on is the base of economic growth, because there doesn't seem to be any obvious um, source of concavity, my learned colleague Bob Gordon notwithstanding. And so, what I really think is happening is that all of those four factors, each in their own way, uh, was mitigated at some point in early modern Europe and kept coming to some kind of um, climax in the 18th century. And so let me just go over them very briefly and then leave it at that. Okay, the first is that in the 18th century, Enlightenment thought slowly but certainly made predatory wars unfashionable. Now, I got to be very careful about this because these are only intra-European predatory wars. Of course, the Europeans sort of channeled, as Nathan was saying, some of their predatory instincts toward other parts of the world. But all the same, there are wars in Europe, including, of course, some very big ones like the French and Napoleonic Wars. But these were not primarily predatory wars, and so the same is true, say, for other wars that we see happening in the 19th century. So the idea that you have a richer country next door and you're going to invade it to take their riches, that's something that falls out of fashion because I think of the way people started thinking about what wars were supposed to do. The other thing that I think matters is, as far as the Enlightenment is concerned, is the Enlightenment was one of the factors that reduced Malthusian pressure, in part at least, because it reduced the influence of religion on household decisions. First in France, of course, where the fertility decline came first, but then eventually it happened. It happened everywhere. And so there are other things that I would associate with the Enlightenment, but the willingness to practice and the ability to practice contraception, of course, is the main factor which reduced Malthusian pressure on the rest of the world. Uh, the central story that I would like to stress here is that, and the book makes this point, I think, quite well. But it needs to be hammered home even harder, because it is really the central story, and everything else I think is sort of incidental. And that is the persuasion that the road to sustained economic success is through the accumulation and dissemination of what 18th century people called useful knowledge. That is to say, the idea that economic and material welfare can be enhanced if we know more, and if we get a connection between uh, the understanding of nature and the application of that understanding to the kind of things that we need. So it's more than science, and people who sort of make a big deal about, well, the scientific revolution was really minor and people didn't really know enough and blah blah blah. That's not the point. The point is really the conviction that this is the way to go. That if you want to relieve human misery, you have to know more about chemistry and more about biology and more about physics and more about astronomy, and on and on and on and on. And so when this thing gets started, you get very small effects because people really didn't know enough. But the pressure toward accumulating knowledge is huge, because people want to get life to be better, and they've convinced themselves that this is the way to go. And I totally agree that governments really play at best second fiddle here, more so perhaps. They play a bigger role on the continent than in Britain, but by and large this is a spontaneous thing, where the government doesn't get in the way, but it doesn't do very much to encourage them. That changes a little bit in the second half of the 19th century, and even more so in the 20th century. But then the government really basically joins something that's already uh, ongoing. So I would think it's more than science. It's the persuasion of how to get society uh, to be better, and I think that is, in some sense, the central story. So how should we then think about this sort of miracle of economic growth that starts happening at some point around 1750? So, what I would like to propose is something like this. Much of history is about negative feedback. Okay, so something, and which is basically a nice way of saying that we are stuck in some kind of equilibrium, and so. A Malthusian model is the classic example, but the other institutional negative feedback mechanism that I proposed earlier is very much like it. And what I would like to propose is that the great enrichment is a shift from a world in which there is primarily negative feedback to a world in which there's primarily positive feedback. Okay, so you can think of this as sort of a complicated dynamic system in which there are some forces for negative feedback and some forces for positive feedback, and they sort of counteract each other. But over time, the positive feedback becomes stronger and stronger. And by 1850, this thing becomes self sustaining. And I think the cultural changes that I talked about with the Enlightenment clearly play a role in that. But you can make a longer list, about things particularly, I think, politics getting part of the story. Interstate competition matters. A whole bunch of things that you can add to this. But what matters is that this is the sort of the triumph of positive feedback over negative feedback, and for that, and through that mechanism, I think what we get is essentially a triumph over what I call the curse of concavity. And what is really striking, and I'll finish with that, and it was really striking about this, and I really got that from while reading DeLong's book, is how incredibly resilient the world has become to shocks that in earlier times would have been absolutely, totally devastating. That in the 20th century, the 20th century, as Brad points out, it was in many ways it was a terrible century. All these horrible disasters happening, and they're still happening, and so on and so forth. And yet, the world recovered from this in an amazingly fast fashion. And it said there's growth of resilience, which I never cease to be amazed about. Uh, we can talk about. Jared mentioned this, the Roman Empire, and when the Roman Empire collapses, the whole thing falls apart for centuries. I mean, this system has no resilience. World War One was much worse than the invasions that ended the Roman Empire, but the world basically got on its feet with a few years later. The same was true in 1945. Hopefully, the same is true in Ukraine when this thing ends. We have become incredibly resilient, and the reason we have become resilient is because growth depends on knowledge, and it's very hard to get rid of knowledge. I mean, sometimes you'd like to, but it's very hard. Once it's there, unless you kill everybody who has the knowledge and you burn every book that contains it, you can't get rid of it. It'll keep coming back. And in that sense, I think the kind of history of the last 200 years is hugely different than what came before. And I think that is maybe the center of the story. And I would say, if you are doing a second edition of this book, you may want to have a chapter on these issues of, concavity and resilience to shock, just as sort of an abstract concept, just as a box to put in uh, things. But otherwise, I think this is a terrific book. And as I was reading it, I'll give you, I kept thinking, gee, I I wish I'd written this book. And so, more power to you, Mark and Jared.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. Thanks. I wouldn't know where to begin except, to certainly thank Lisa, Nathan, Joel for not just those amazing comments, but a ton of food for thought. Maybe I'll just say something. I was taking notes throughout on each comment. Maybe take something from each panelist. So Lisa, I mean, I'd say that we certainly agree that the state is central to a lot of the processes we're talking about. I certainly agree that what we focused on, even when we discussed state capacity, was kind of the state in a sense already being there and trying to, so we don't have as much really, and which is something very clearly important. I think it hit on a couple of things Nathan was talking about too, with where does this come from in the first place. This is something that Mark and I have worked on individually as well, thinking about how states are legitimated, or that how essentially rulers rule. And this kind of also, I think, gets to one of the very last comments Joel was making as well, is that when we're thinking about all of these other, maybe whether you call them Hayekian or whatever, processes that are highly decentralized, for me, in a sense, I used the term before, but I didn't really explain what I meant. The dog that didn't bark is really when the state's not, when the state just doesn't interfere. For me, essentially, my reading of the literature and of the history is that there needs to be a minimum of state capacity for anything like what we're discussing, or how we're how we're talking right now, or more or less any level of economic development to occur. You obviously need some type of state to secure basic rights, things like this. But I think that this obviously goes too far as well. This is obviously, Lisa, this is much of what you study as well, is on states that encroach on rights, and really that's that again. So I think that when we think about the role of the state in these processes, it can actually be kind of difficult to draw it out empirically. The type of studies like Nathan was talking about. I think it can be really difficult because oftentimes it's just when the state's not involved in understanding something or even getting data on something that's not there is typically much harder. And yeah, I mean, I'd agree that when on a further point you made when thinking about what was omitted, in some cases I would say there are certainly intentional omissions in this book. In other cases, there's not. I mean, in other cases, there's things that as soon as they've been brought up afterwards, after the book was already published or was sent to Polity, our publisher, and then we realized, we really should have talked about X, Y, or Z. Yeah, I mean, I think that again, hopefully, this is something obviously more than just taking notes on, but really, in all seriousness, really thinking about hoping to have another edition where we do talk about these things. And I think that the stuff, Lisa, you brought up is central. So yeah, Nathan, and maybe I can talk about some of the stuff that both Nathan and Lisa brought up, as well as kind of thinking about both these kind of cross-cultural, not just purely cross-cultural, I'd say, but what Nathan brought up is this kind of zero-sum nature, or I would even say, frankly, a lot of the stuff is negative sum. Certainly when we're talking about slave trade and the worst the atrocities that happen to indigenous populations. These are things that I think that the book could be, and I think to some degree should be, framed in such a way, because this is also the way I think a lot of people, especially outside of academia, really certainly think about the wealth being perhaps as a zero sum or possibly even a negative sum game, especially as it emerged in Europe and via colonial enterprises. And I think a careful accounting of that, and and I think as Nathan, you were hinting at there, and I think Joel is certainly hinting at a lot of what's happened, especially in the last 150 years or so, I think is very clearly positive sum, in understanding how that why that's the case, and how that could possibly be the case in a world that was still quite poor, is among the most, I think, important things we can do. And Nathan, I think it was to the point you brought up at the end, that when we really think about development today and what development economists do in particular, I do think that and really we can thank Ashimolu Johnson Robinson, I think, for bringing some of history into development, for sure. But this is still something where I'd like to think that some of the lessons that we put forth in this book can be used to really understand too, that again, now maybe to bring into Joel's points, some of these, when we think about the role of policy, oftentimes policy is more so getting out of the way. It's protecting certain rights, and then maybe encouraging on some margins, but actually for the most part, it's about getting out of the way. Now, as Nathan, as you noted, in the U.S. case, that wasn't really the case, right? And industrial policy really did matter in U.S. economic history. On the other hand, I think one thing I would take from this book is I'm not totally sure how good the U.S. case is to look at in terms of what can we do for the poorest parts of the world today. I think we actually we now have much better cases of places that are both under autocratic rule. So it's not just China, but even a place like say South Korea became wealthy under autocratic rule. Of course, as we note in the book too, when we're talking about East Asia, there were geographic factors that mattered as well. So all right. So on that, I guess moving to some of the stuff Joel said, and I think honestly, I think the last thing Joel said is not just the highest compliment we've gotten in this book. I would actually say it might be the highest compliment I've ever gotten in my career. That Joel Mokyr wishes that he had written a book that we wrote. That's I don't know how much you meant that, Joel, but thank you. I don't know if you know how much something like that means, and I would assume Mark, even though he can't really speak right now, would think the same. Yeah, no, I mean, I know how, so Joel, I think, especially in the chapter on industrialization, I think it did come out how much, we certainly, favor your hypothesis, not, really in all three of, the books that really take it on head on, The Gifts of Athena, Enlightened Economy, and Culture of Growth. Yeah. And this was kind of, this was I agree now that you kind of say it like this, it does make sense to kind of think about having a chapter. And maybe this is, so obviously DeLong's book will be something that we also, if we write another book, we'll have to tackle as we move on, into the what I guess he calls the long 20th century. Resilience to shock, I think, is clearly something that, we also mention it, earlier on, because, John Wallace has a separate paper with Broadberry that I think both Mark and I, we cite early on and kind of agree with as being important, is when we look at growth spurts throughout history, it's more about not falling back than it is moving forward. A lot of societies move forward on occasion, but most of them, obviously a lot of this is through Malthusian processes, eventually fall back. And this is what I think, DeLong actually, he does in a lot of words, as you noted. He's a verbose man. It's the resiliency that matters, and it's not something we tackle. And in part because I think it's also something where it's certainly before Brad's book, it's not as something that was as big in the literature. And we did try to focus on things that were out there, in part because I think, in part because we wanted at least most of the book to be a survey. And in part because I think we wanted the answer, for lack of a better word, because we don't give an answer, but the answer to draw from the literature, both, to a much lesser extent when we've done, and, to a larger extent, what people on this call and, other kind of the other big papers have done. So, I mean, I think in as short as I can, that's getting at about 1% of what was said here. But, thank you all for these comments. And really, I do really hope that we are allowed to write another version of this, because I think the exciting thing about not just this book, but this literature, is that the book will look a lot different. If we say, this book came out in 2022, if the second edition comes out in, say, 2032, it will look different for the two reasons I brought up earlier. One is that there's just going to be stuff that happens in the world. And, frankly, even, so the Ukrainian-Russian situation you bring up is, a measure of resilience. And it is kind of amazing that even now you're seeing, economic resilience in the Ukraine or in Ukraine. But obviously we don't know what's going to happen by that period. More importantly, I think in terms of this book, is that there's just so much work being done right now that is changing, I think, the way we think about some things. And some of it, we don't know what the outcome is going to be. So, Joachim Voth has this paper on the role of colonization or, colonial enterprise into specifically, British industrialization. How that paper is received, what responses to it, might change how we think a little bit about that important process that is an important part of this book. And that's just, that's off the top of my head, one example of something that I think, along with all of these suggestions, plus much more that we've thought about since, that we've read since, that have been brought to our attention since, hopefully will be part of that journey.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.